I'm going to send you right straight. We're going to go right straight into the book of Ruth this morning. So I'm going to have you pick up your Bibles, if you will. There's plenty in the pews. Ruth is a little difficult to find because it's a small book. It's a short book, one of those little 4-chapter books. Doesn't occupy much space. In my Bible, it's about here. It's right around Kings, and before that, if you find Judges in the Old Testament. If you're using a Pew Bible, as long as it's the regular size print one, it's on page 257. I wrote that down this morning. Will help you out a little bit. Begins the story of Ruth. Ruth, while you're getting there, Ruth holds a special place in Scripture. It's one of only 2 books in the 66 books of the canon that's named after a woman, Ruth and Esther. Only 2 books, which for the time in history that Ruth was written, about 5 centuries before Jesus was born, is an amazing thing that to have a book named after you and be a woman at that time in history. It's also one of the most powerful books and one of the most uplifting books, though it starts on a difficult note, and that's where we're going to start, on a difficult note here with Ruth. Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn into the country of Moab, and he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. And they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab, and they remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and without her husband. Then she arose with her daughter-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard the fields of the Lord of Moab, that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you find rest, each of you in your house, of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." We're going to hold it right there for just a second. This is not a bedtime story you'd want to tell to little kids, right? Ruth doesn't start, it opens more like an Agatha Christie novel, I think. By the time we get 7 verses in, we have 3 people who have shed their mortal coil, as Shakespeare would have written it anyways. And all of them are part of Naomi, this woman Naomi's family. It would have been easier, I think, if the author, who we're not sure who it is, we think possibly it was Samuel, who wrote a book or 2 in the Bible, right? We believe that Samuel may have wrote it, but it would have been easier if he just started introduced by saying, "Hi, my name is Naomi, and my life is a complete mess right now," right? I'm going through a really tough time. Seriously, this is a pretty dour start. It's one of the saddest beginnings to any book in the Bible, I think, to what becomes a very great and uplifting story. But then again, sometimes our stories are like that, right? Sometimes not every one of our stories begins with a great start. Sometimes a story we might write about ourselves, we might start in a difficult place in our life. Sometimes our stories begin with trouble and with heartache. Not all the time, of course. If it did, the world would be a very bleak place. But launching a story the way the author did, launching this story and introducing us to Naomi and her surviving daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, has a particular point for the author. It brings up a question that we all have to face once in a while. What's the best path forward when everything in life turns sour? Right? What's the best path to take? You know what I'm saying? What's the best direction to go? What's the best path, the way forward when life basically smacks you right between the eyes? What's the direction to go? How do we come up from zero, from the ground, when we're all the way at the bottom of that ladder? To answer that, we need to know just a little bit about the story of Naomi. We're going to start with Naomi. We'll work towards Ruth. We need to know a little bit more background about the story of Naomi. The story of Ruth starts with a change of address, right? Verse 1, it says that in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, so a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife, that's Naomi, and his 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now, anybody who's this is a difficult start right here, right? Anybody who's changed addresses knows that it's a really big deal, especially if you're moving a fairly long ways, right? When we left for seminary years ago, we moved from this little town in Vermont down to the north shore of Massachusetts, where the seminary was, Gordon Conwell Seminary. And so we moved from living in our own home to living in a little apartment on campus in a building that had 50 or 60 apartments in it, and all of a sudden we had neighbors like literally right down the hall sort of thing, and it was, and moved the kids into a different school and all that stuff. And then we finished seminary. We moved to Beverly, Mass for a little while so our kids could finish school while I was traveling back and forth up here. And then we moved to Gray for a while and lived in Gray, Maine. And then we moved, finally we bought a little spot and we moved down here into North Yarmouth, back when North Yarmouth was affordable, right? Moved into that little place. And there were years like when the people from U-Haul would send us Christmas cards. How you doing? You getting ready to move again by any chance? We're here for you, sort of thing. Nice to see you, Mac and Diane. How are the kids? Sort of thing. It was pretty crazy. Moving can in itself be a very stressful time. Some of you have recently moved, and you know what I'm talking about, right? But there's more to this move than just swapping zip codes, right? Moab, the area of Moab, was considered an enemy to Israel. Centuries before this, when the Israelites had moved into the Promised Land, they had traveled through Moab, and the people of Moab had refused to give the Israelites, the wandering Israelites, who would have been under Joshua's lead at that time, had refused to give them help, to give them bread and to give them water for their journey. They had turned them down. And so when God spoke to Moses, and Moses was writing all this down, they were creating the Jewish law, which began with the 10 Commandments and then went into all these little sub-clauses. When they got to the part about where you could go and where you couldn't, Moab was strictly off the list. It says in Deuteronomy, it says this, it says, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. What that means is if you lived in Moab or you emigrated to Moab and became a citizen of that country, you were not allowed to come back and worship in the temple in Jerusalem for 10 generations. Your entire family was banned from the place, right? You just couldn't go there. So not just you and your family, but your children and their children and their children and their children. After that, all of them were banned from worship. And worship was the center of life in Israel, right? Worship was the Facebook of the day, if you will, or whatever it might be. It It was the place where people gathered. And so this was a really serious penalty they had to take to pack up and move. And it tells us that things must have been pretty desperate when they packed up and moved their family. The thing with the famine. That famine must have been pretty serious for them to go and move there. So they sacrificed a lot to move to this land. And they weren't allowed to come back. That was just the law of Moses. That was the law as it existed in Jewish history. But even as challenging as that was, right, things quickly got worse for Naomi. First, her husband, Elimelech, passed away. He died. We don't know from what. But her husband, leaving her a widow. And then her 2 sons passed away as well. They were married, and they passed away. And that leads to something that we have to know in order to understand the story of Ruth and this overarching story of Ruth and faithfulness and all this other stuff and Naomi's going on. Something that we really have to know, something that the ancients who are reading this story, if they were reading this 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, they would have got it in a heartbeat. But we, in the 21st century, we probably wouldn't. And it's something that the whole story hinges on. If you were a widow in the 5th century BC, life was very difficult for you. In fact, life was in peril. Widows had no safety nets, especially the ones that lived outside of Israel, right? And especially if you had no surviving male children. Here's how the law went. If you became a widow, your husband died, your husband's brother would marry you and bring you into his family, right? Even if he was married, he'd marry you. He'd bring you into his family and take care of you. That was the way things worked. So we have to assume that Elimelech here, he doesn't have any brothers. He's probably an only child or an only male child. Failing that, your sons would take care of you. If you had a son, it was then fell to him. It was his responsibility to take his mother into his household and just, build a little in-law apartment, right? You see these in-law apartments everywhere today. They'd build a little in-law apartment. His mother would come in, and she would live with his family, and he would take care of her. There were little provisions that way. But not in this case. Because Naomi's had 3 strikes, right? She's lost her husband, who has no brothers. She's lost 1 son, and then she's lost another son. So she's in really deep trouble. The only possibility for her survival in this land would be if perhaps she was young enough to go out and fetch a new husband, right? Attract a new mate. And a little later on in the story, we didn't read this far, Naomi says to her daughters who want to go with her, she says, no, turn back, for I'm too old to have a husband. Which in this day probably meant she was like 22 or 23 or something like that, right? No, it was probably older than that, because she also says, even if I took a husband and was able to bear a child this year, bear sons for you to marry again, would you wait another 15 years for them to grow up? She said, no, you're not going to do that. You guys need to go away. So now we're starting to get a feel for what Naomi's going through. She's lost all her support lines. She's lost all her connections. And even worse, she lives in a foreign land where there's no support for widows. If she was in Israel, things would be a little bit better. See, God has a heart for widows and orphans and travelers, sojourners, right? So in that same book of Deuteronomy, the Jewish law, about a chapter later, it says this. It says, when you reap your harvest in your field and you forget a sheaf, you shall not go back to get it. It'll be for the sojourner, the fatherless, orphans, and the widow. that the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hands. So see, if you were a widow in Israel, you had a little bit of a shot. Because in Israel, if you were a farmer and you were picking your grain out of your fields and you left a little bit, one corner, actually people would do this on purpose. They would leave part of their fields, the edges, unpicked. They wouldn't pick the grain from there. Or if you had an orchard, figs, let's say you had an orchard full of fig trees, and you left some of the trees unpicked. Or if you had a vineyard with grapes hanging off the vines, and you maybe didn't get into that back corner of the orchard to pick your grapes, right? That was there for the widow. That was there for the orphans. That was there for the weary travelers to come and eat. So Israel had some provisions to help the widow at least a little bit. But Naomi doesn't live in Israel. She lives in Moab. And they had made this decision 10 years earlier. Her and her husband had made this decision to turn away from their homeland and go to this kind of enemy territory sort of thing. And that's akin to turning your back on God. And now we've got the heart of the problem, right? After all that stuff we just went through, we got to the heart of the problem. Naomi, along with her husband and her children, had sort of turned their back on God, and life hadn't gone very well since. Right? Now she's in desperate straits, and she needs God's help. She needs any kind of help she can get, even though she's convinced, right? Even though she's convinced that God was the one who did all this to her, and she has no proof of that. There's nothing in this story of Ruth and Naomi and all these people that God was out to get Naomi, right? Seems to be just the winds of fate had blown in her life and had all these terrible things befall her. She, however, is kind of convinced. She's angry at God. Man, is she mad. There's a little passage again later on, and I encourage you when you go home today to read chapter 1. It's about a 5-minute read. It's very, very short. It's only like 25 verses or something like that. And it's a great story. But she is so angry at God. She meets some old friends on the trail after she sets her eyes back on where she came from, the land she came from. She meets some old friends, and they say, "Wow, aren't you Naomi? I haven't seen you in years." And she says to them, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Marah. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Marah is a word it's a Hebrew word. It means bitter. So she is angry at God. She's angry at life. Maybe she's got a reason to be at least angry in life. And she's wounded. She's like this wounded animal, angry at life, even angrier at God. Put in simple terms, this woman is a hot mess right now. She really is. Her life is a hot mess. And who wouldn't be? Right? Who wouldn't be among us to have all this tragedy befall us and have no means of support? She reminds me a lot as I sat and I read this story 3 times earlier this week. All I could think of was some of the women that we meet on the streets in Portland when we bring out food on Mondays, right? We bring out food on Mondays, and I haven't been able to go in the last few weeks to different appointments and stuff like that, but we have a team who brings food out to the streets of Portland and feeds the homeless. They do a wonderful job, 70, 80, 90 meals every Monday. And you meet people like this woman, right, who just, the clothes are different. You know, Naomi wasn't dressed in blue jeans and a jacket, and the situations are kind of different, but the experience is the same. They're people living without hope. People for whom, from whatever circumstances, life has just pulled the rug right out from underneath them, right? Kind of like those people in Turkey and Syria right now. Couldn't help but thinking of them every time I read this text. You know, there's no more troubling season in life than when life deals you blow after blow and you can't see your way forward. And yet it's universal to the human experience. Everyone faces a time in their life when life kind of goes sideways on us, right? When things go sideways. The job you were hoping to get goes to somebody else. The person you love so dearly turns out not to love you. As someone close to you suddenly passes away with no warning, no explanation, right? And it leaves a huge hole in your heart. We all have seasons where life tosses us into the tumbler and just tosses us for a loop. And when those happen, when those seasons come, we can choose several different paths. Now, wait a second. Pastor, you've been talking about Naomi. Where's Ruth? Right? Isn't that the name of the book? Where's Ruth? Well, let me just pause for a second. Ruth doesn't play a big part in chapter 1. Plays a very tiny, small part. She's really only got one good line in chapter 1. And you might have heard it before. She turns to Naomi, who's getting ready to head back to Israel, hoping to find a little hope there. And she says to her mother-in-law, Naomi, who doesn't want her to go, wants her to stay. She says, no. She says, you know what? Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. And your people will be my people, and your God, my God. That sounds just a little bit familiar, right? Some little no-name artist by the name of Chris Tomlin picked those words up 2,500 years later and turned them into a song we sang this morning. Where you go, I go. Where you stay, I stay. Right? Tremendous amount of friendship and companionship and loyalty, right? But not yet. That's in chapter 1. But we won't develop her character until next week. Come back next week, same bat time, same bat channel, right? People who are old enough are going, oh yeah, I remember that, right? Cartoons and Saturday morning and all that good stuff. Come back next week, we'll talk a whole lot about Ruth. But for the moment, we've got this woman who has been slammed up against the wall, just slammed up against the wall. And when we get slammed up, when we have those seasons where everything, the winds blow against us everywhere we go, and we get knocked down to the ground, there are three choices we can take, right? There are really three choices. We can curl up, right? Curl up in a ball and just wait till it passes, because hopefully life's going to get better. A lot of people do that. They curl up, life turns bad, and we just kind of curl up like a pill bug, right? Curl up into a ball. Pill bugs, you remember those? Remember those? You'd give them a little tap, and they spin right up into a ball, just waiting for the danger to pass, right? We can curl up and sit it out and hope things change, which, as one theologian once said, really dishonors God, right? It means we're not looking to God at all. We're just kind of hunkering down. We're not asking God to do anything. We're just hoping to get through the pain. It also tends to make us bitter. It makes us ramah when we curl up. Because when things don't get better right away, we just kind of, we live through it. And every day you wake up and nothing's better. You sit up in bed and you lift the shades and nothing's better out there. Your life still stinks. And so you do that long enough and you get sort of bitter. When we curl up and we don't move ahead, we blame God. There's Naomi blaming God, right? Saying God has dealt bitterly with me. Or some people make this choice. We can stand up and run. I think that's the most popular choice. We can stand up and run and hope to distract ourselves, right? Distract ourselves long enough that it doesn't hurt anymore. In the Bible, one of the best runners is the prodigal son. Remember the prodigal son? Jesus told that parable. Love that little parable. Jesus tells the parable, prodigal son. He's on his father's farm, and life really stinks. You know, they're down behind a hill. They can't get satellite dish. They don't have anything, right? So they're just tired of living. He's tired of living under his father's rule, under his father's house, and he says, "Give me my inheritance. I'm heading to the big city." And his father gives him his inheritance, and he takes this big sack full of money, and he runs off to the big city. Wine, women, and song. He's going to have a good time in the big city, only to find out that running eventually was not the answer he was looking for. Sometimes we run from our troubles. When our troubles press us down, we stand up and we run the other way. Go into a bar room on a Saturday night, and a lot of those people sitting on the stools, right? They're just trying to run away from whatever's pushing them down in life. Standing up and running doesn't solve our problems any more than curling up does. It just helps us ignore them for a little while. And then there's this third option that beats the others by the mile. Instead of standing up or curling up, we can look up, which is seeking God's future. What we're doing, we can seek God's future in the midst of our presence. That's what Naomi does in this first chapter of Ruth, right? That's what she does. She decides that she's going to head back to her homeland, even though she knows she's probably not welcome there, right? But she's heard, there's a little key, a little hint the author put in the very first line. She's heard, in first or second line, she's heard that there's food there, that God has looked positively on the people of her old homeland. Verse 6, it says, "Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields that the Lord had visited his people and given them food." She'd heard that even though Israel, which in this time was a hot mess in itself, right? And they were sinning against God, and it was the time of the judges, and the kings were coming, and it was just a messy time in Israel's history. She had heard that God had turned a merciful eye to her homeland. And so she's like, okay, maybe if God could do that, could it possibly be that in his infinite mercy, help a poor widow like me, even though I'm not supposed to be welcome there? Could it be that hope upon hope, wishes upon wishes, that God's grace is bigger than anything we've ever experienced and can't be bound in even by laws or restrictions or our past or our pain, that God's grace is bigger than any of that, maybe for this woman and maybe even for us. You see, that's the point of the whole story, at least this very first chapter, right? The point of the whole story is new beginnings begin with trusting God. New beginnings begin with trusting God. Whatever your situation, whatever life has thrown at you, no matter how difficult things seem, no matter how dark and dreary it looks around you, right? God can open up new futures. He can offer grace where there seems to be no grace to be found. We just have to look up and see it. New beginnings begin with trusting God. Instead of curling up and becoming bitter, and instead of standing up and running away, God wants us to look up and follow Him into a brand new future that He is opening up. And that's the story that begins Ruth. How about you? Right? How about you? One of the things they teach us in seminary very early, when we start classes on how to write a message and do a sermon and all that stuff, give the audience someone to identify with. They say that every book of the Bible has a character that you can identify with it. In this case, that's very true, but I think it's more about finding ourselves in Naomi than it is in Ruth. Is there something in your life, right? Is there something in your life where you curled up and decided to let it ride? Just hope the pain gets better after a time? Or is there some part of your life that you're running away from, that you're trying to hide? It's easier to avoid and confront. Guys do this all the time, by the way. They call it midlife crisis, right? Why do guys go out and buy a sports car or a huge boat when they turn 45, right? It's because it's like they look in the mirror and it's like, oh my gosh, there's gray hair, there's wrinkles, things are happening here. I better go buy a sports car. A big one with a big engine and a 4-speed or a 6-speed, right? Guys we call that the midlife crisis. It's really part of standing up and running away. If either of those things describe you, Naomi has some advice for us. New beginnings begin with trusting God. New beginnings begin with trusting God. Say that with me. New beginnings begin with trusting God. They sure do. Let's pray.